On September 14, 2023, NASA held a public press conference to release the findings of its independent UAP study team, a panel of 16 scientists, including astrophysicists, a former NASA astronaut, and a Nobel laureate, convened specifically to assess unidentified aerial phenomena using rigorous scientific method. The press conference was streamed live. It received coverage for about 48 hours. Most of that coverage focused on a single quotable line. The panel found no evidence that UAP sightings are extraterrestrial in origin. That line traveled everywhere. It became the headline, the thumbnail, the closing statement of 100 different news segments. But the actual transcript of that hearing runs over 90 minutes and contains a separate statement made by NASA's own administrator and reinforced by the panel's leader that received almost none of that same coverage. A statement that, if you actually sit with it, says something far more specific and far more uncomfortable than "we found nothing." But this is not the story you think it is. You might expect me to tell you NASA accidentally confirmed something extraterrestrial during that hearing. That is not what the transcript shows, and I'm not going to claim that because it would generate more clicks. What the transcript actually shows is something that requires no speculation about aliens at all, and is arguably more significant precisely because it doesn't. NASA's own scientific leadership, on the public record, under their own microphone, admitted that the agency's data collection methodology for this entire category of phenomena has been so poor for so long that rigorous scientific conclusions are currently impossible, not because the phenomena aren't real, but because the data quality problem is, in their own words, severe enough to prevent science from doing its job. That is a confession about institutional failure, made voluntarily, on camera, and it is sitting in the public record right now mostly unexamined. So here's the question worth pulling on for the next several minutes. If NASA's own panel admitted the data is too poor to draw scientific conclusions, why did almost every headline about that hearing report the opposite, that no evidence was found? As if that were a confident scientific result rather than a direct consequence of the data problem, the panel itself described in the same breath. There's a documented distinction in the philosophy of science called the difference between absence of evidence and evidence of absence. It is not a niche academic point. It is taught in introductory research methods courses, and it matters enormously for exactly this kind of story. "We found no evidence" can mean two completely different things. It can mean researchers looked carefully with reliable instruments and found nothing, which is a meaningful negative result. Or it can mean the available data was too inconsistent, too poorly collected, or too contaminated by sensor error to support any conclusion at all, which is not a negative result, it's a measurement problem. NASA's own panel, in the actual transcript, explicitly described the second situation, not the first. That's not my interpretation. That's the panel's own characterization of its findings, stated directly in response to a reporter's question, available in the full video and the official transcript NASA itself published. Now here's the detail that should not exist if this had genuinely been a clean negative scientific result. During the question and answer portion of the hearing, Dr. David Spergel, the panel's chair and a working astrophysicist at the Simons Foundation, was asked directly why the panel couldn't reach firmer conclusions. His answer on the record was that the vast majority of UAP reports analyzed by the panel came from sensor systems, military radar, infrared cameras, and similar equipment that were never designed or calibrated for the specific task of identifying unknown aerial objects, and that this mismatch between what the sensors were built to do and what they were being asked to detect introduced enough ambiguity to make scientific conclusions about the nature of most reported objects effectively impossible with current data. Read that statement again. NASA's own panel chair said, under his own name, in a public hearing, that the equipment used to investigate this entire subject for decades was the wrong equipment for the job. Wait. If the sensors weren't built for this task, then every official, no extraordinary explanation found, conclusion drawn from that sensor data, for the past several decades was built on a measurement foundation the scientist's own panel chair was now publicly describing as inadequate. I kept reading the transcript looking for what happened immediately after that admission, and what I found explains exactly why this particular thread never gained traction in the broader conversation. Immediately following Spergel's statement about sensor inadequacy, NASA Administrator Bill Nelson made a second statement that connects directly to it. Nelson stated on the record that the stigma associated with reporting UAP sightings has historically discouraged commercial pilots and trained observers from filing reports through official channels, specifically because of fear of ridicule or professional consequence, and that NASA's own panel identified this stigma as a measurable barrier to data quality, not just an incidental cultural footnote. This is documented in the official NASA transcript and was reiterated in NASA's own subsequent written report following the hearing. So the picture that emerges from the institution's own words, when you actually connect these two specific admissions instead of just quoting the closing headline, is this. The sensors weren't built for the task, and the most qualified potential witnesses, professional pilots with the training to describe what they saw accurately, were actively discouraged from reporting by a stigma that NASA itself acknowledges it played a role in creating across decades of dismissive public messaging. Let me be precise here about fact versus hypothesis versus speculation, because that precision is the entire point of this particular investigation. Facts. NASA's UAP Independent Study Team held a public hearing on September 14, 2023, and the full transcript is published by NASA itself. Dr. David Spergel, the panel chair, stated on the record that sensor systems used historically were not designed for UAP identification, creating data quality limitations. NASA Administrator Bill Nelson stated, also on the record, that social stigma has historically discouraged reporting and that the panel identified this as a measurable barrier. The panel's official conclusion, also documented, was that current data is insufficient to determine the nature of most reported UAP, not that the phenomena have been positively explained by conventional means. Hypotheses supported by circumstantial evidence, that the gap between the nuanced, methodologically specific statements made in the hearing and the simplified, no evidence found headline that dominated coverage reflects how media incentives systematically favor simple conclusions over accurate, but more complicated ones. Decades of institutional dismissiveness toward this topic, which NASA's own administrator partially acknowledged, created the exact data quality problem that is now used to justify continued inconclusiveness. Speculation without solid factual basis, that NASA possesses better quality data privately that contradicts its public insufficient data position. I have no verifiable evidence for that specific claim and will not present it as fact. Now think carefully about what this actually means once you hold both admissions together instead of separately. If the sensors weren't built for the task, and the most credible class of potential witnesses was systematically discouraged from reporting by an institutional culture of dismissal, then the 50-plus years of no extraordinary evidence found conclusions were never actually testing the hypothesis they claimed to be testing. They were testing a much narrower question. What do poorly suited instruments capture when the best available human observers are too afraid of professional ridicule to file detailed reports? That is a completely different scientific question than is there anything unexplained happening in the sky, and conflating the two is exactly the kind of move that produces decades of confident-sounding negative conclusions built on a foundation the institution's own leadership now describes, in its own words, as inadequate. I know what you might be thinking right now. Every scientific field has measurement limitations, and acknowledging them honestly is exactly what good science is supposed to do. This isn't necessarily a cover-up, it might just be intellectual honesty finally showing up in public. And you'd be completely right that intellectual honesty about limitations is a sign of good science, not bad faith. Here's what makes this case specifically worth sitting with: the gap between what the scientists said in the room and what the public actually absorbed from the coverage of that same hearing. NASA being honest about its own data limitations is commendable. The media ecosystem converting that nuanced admission into a confident, "nothing's there" headline, and that headline becoming the dominant public memory of the hearing, is a completely separate failure, one that has nothing to do with NASA's scientific integrity, and everything to do with how complex institutional honesty gets flattened into simple, shareable conclusions by the time it reaches you. But there is a question almost nobody is asking about this hearing specifically, and it reframes the entire conversation around it. The question is not, did NASA find evidence of something extraordinary? The transcript clearly shows they did not claim that, and didn't have the data quality to claim much of anything definitive either way. The actual question worth asking is this: now that NASA's own panel has formally identified two specific, named, fixable problems, inadequate sensors and reporting stigma, what has actually changed in the sensor design and reporting culture since September 2023, and is anyone tracking whether those two specific recommendations are being implemented, or did the recommendations disappear into the same media cycle that buried the nuance of the original hearing? In April 2024, NASA followed through on one specific recommendation from that hearing by appointing its first-ever director of UAP research, a position explicitly created in response to the panel's finding that the agency lacked coordinated leadership on this issue. This is documented in NASA's own public announcement. The appointment received a fraction of the coverage that the original no evidence headline received 8 months earlier, despite being a direct structural, institutional response to the exact data quality problems the panel had identified. That gap in coverage, between the viral dismissal and the quiet institutional follow-through, is itself a measurable piece of evidence about how this entire subject moves through public attention. And then I understood. The thing nobody noticed during that hearing wasn't a hidden confirmation of anything extraordinary. It was NASA's own scientists quietly admitting that the instrument we've used for 50 years to answer this question was never built to answer it, and watching that admission get replaced, within the same news cycle, by the much simpler headline the public was already primed to expect. So what do you do with this? First, whenever you see a no evidence found headline about any complex scientific subject, check the original source for the methodology section, not just the conclusion. The difference between we looked carefully and found nothing, and our tools couldn't reliably look, changes everything about what the finding actually means. Second, institutional admissions of their own measurement limitations deserve more public attention than they typically receive, because acknowledging a flawed methodology is the necessary first step toward fixing it, and tracking whether that fix actually happens is a legitimate, answerable question anyone can follow. Third, stigma around reporting isn't a minor cultural detail in scientific data collection. It's a documented confound that the field of psychology has studied extensively in completely unrelated contexts, from workplace safety incident reporting to medical error disclosure, and recognizing the same pattern here connects this story to a much broader, well-established body of research. Fourth, when an institution creates a new role or policy specifically in response to a previously identified failure, that quiet follow-through is often more informative than the original dramatic headline, precisely because it's not designed to be exciting, it's designed to actually fix the thing. So what did NASA's own scientists admit during that hearing that few people noticed? Not evidence of anything extraordinary. Something more specific, and in its own way, more consequential. That the scientific tools and reporting culture used to investigate this entire category of phenomena for over 5 decades were inadequate to the task, acknowledged openly, on the record, by the panel's own chair and the agency's own administrator. The headline that survived that hearing told you the search came up empty. The transcript tells you the search was never properly built to find anything in the first place, and that NASA has now formally said so, in public, under its own name. The question that will stay with you after this video ends is the one almost nobody followed up on. If the instrument has now been publicly declared broken, and a new director has been appointed specifically to fix it, what happens the next time someone reports something genuinely unexplained? Will the new censors and the new reporting culture actually be ready to take it seriously, or will the next headline simply repeat the same flattened conclusion all over again?